Alrighty, so today we're going to be building this very simple component that shows you a piece of advice. And upon this click of a button, it's going to fetch some data and render this, the particular data that we grabbed into this component. I'm going to try, as per usual, writing fairly simple, very readable code. I'm going to try explaining what I'm doing along the way. If you have any criticism, just drop it down below. It really helps me out. Thank you. An API is how your website or web app will communicate and either send or receive information from a different service. In the case of our application, we are trying to fetch a random piece of advice. The first thing for us to do is to use the fetch method in order to make a request for the data, in this case some data containing advice. The fetch request is received by an API. An API is essentially a translator or a switchboard operator that gets a request, communicates the request to an endpoint, usually another application or a server, and depending on whether the endpoint received a correct request, something it expects, it will either communicate the data back to the API or it will communicate a rejection, a failure. The API then returns us the data in the form of a promise, but that's mostly due to the fetch method. We will go into the promises a bit later on. Assuming we send the correct information, and assuming the endpoint confirmed this by sending the correct data to the API, our promise will essentially be fulfilled and we have received the data we wanted in the first place from the API. Okie dokes, to get started, we have the design over here, and you can see it's not really a complicated design, thankfully, it's just this nice little card. The way we're going to be tackling this is that our entire container body will be a grid. This too will be a grid, and if I just select these two, the grid will literally look like this. It's going to be this top part that ends here. There's another little row, and the button is basically in between this low row and this side. And you'll see how all this stuff works. But yeah, it's going to be really nice and simple code, hopefully. So let's get started with HTML. So for now we've got body. Yes, let's load in our style sheets. I'll cover what my reset is in a moment. Styles main, of course, for the main styling. We're going to add a script tag as we're going to be adding some JavaScript later on. And of course, we're going to add defer. All that you have to understand with defer is that our JavaScript file will load and will run JavaScript in a browser after our HTML is loaded. So if you want to grab an element with JavaScript, you should probably wait for that element to actually be on the page. That's why defer is just, you just have to use it. Cool, let's get started with adding the title and just starting by adding a div. I'm going to be using a div. It could be an article, could be something else. It's really up to you and really depends on your project. The class will be just advice generator and it's going to contain all this stuff. Div class, and then we're going to have advice generator output. So output is just this blue box over here, yeah, excluding the button effectively. The little quotation, or rather the advice number, will be a span with a class of advice generator. Advice number. I'm just going to add this dummy text here for now. And of course, quotation, advice generator quote. Nice. And let's just add the quote. So now we should see the advice, we can see the quote, very good. And then this turns out it's a picture. I thought initially these are like, two spans with this pause button like image in the middle. No, the whole thing is an image. So, and it's split, it turns out, into two images, desktop and mobile. So whenever I use responsive images, or rather responsive based on your viewport width, right? Whenever you tackle this, I really like using picture, and you'll see why. The first thing you put into picture, obviously after a class, of just divider for us, is a source. And a source is basically where you put a media query. Okay, so depending on this particular media query, use this particular image link, and you'll see what I mean. So here's our media query with 545 pixels. And then we have a source set, and we're just aiming at the desktop. So when our viewport reaches a minimum width of this, let's use this basically, right? Otherwise, it's gonna run this little image, which is just a mobile one, and that's it. It's as simple as that. And you can add more arguments, you know, to more sources. Just copy this upwards and, you know, add another screen size, another image link. It just goes on. But this is a very nice, clean way of doing this. And then we're pretty much done with this box. We can just do the button now. So button, advice generator button. You can be better with your naming. I wasn't particularly concerned with this. Image, assets, icon dice. And of course, let's add a class, advice generator, button image, and a little alt. That's it. That's our HTML. We've got everything we need to start styling stuff now. And at this stage, you might want to open your style guide, just kind of have a little look-see. Not too many colors. I'm not going to bother with any variables. Yeah, font size, not really interested in that because there's a lot of font sizes. Family, font family rather, manrope. So you can follow this link, of course, and it's just going to take you here. So what they're suggesting is weight 800. Now I found issues with just following exactly as they put stuff, because in a browser, fonts sometimes show differently than they do in Figma. So sometimes I make a executive decision and I decide I'm going to use bold 700 instead of this extra bold 800 that they suggested, and it looks better. So yeah. Yeah, just select whatever fonts you want. You probably want to import it into your CSS. Just copy that. Here's the actual CSS rules to specify families. Awesome. And you'll see that happening now. So you're gonna grab the import, and then in body, let's just quickly start styling stuff. Yeah, background, min height, display of grid, and then let's place items to the center. So that places everything perfectly to the center, as you can see there. And let's add a little bit of padding. Yeah, that will do fine. Now, advice generator is this basically the grid that contains this output container where all this quote stuff is, and the button. So first of all, we set the font family, and every single child now will inherit this font family. That's roughly how fonts work in CSS. So yeah, stuff will inherit it. Width will be 100%, but it will also have a max width of 54 rem, as we do have a max width, as you can see here, 540 pixels, right? And I should probably mention that in my recent CSS, where I'm just really setting stuff to 0, margins, paddings, etc., just to start from scratch, right? I am using font size 62.5%. All this really means is that usually one room is equal to 16 pixels, but I don't want to be doing this calculation every time, every time I'm trying to do this stuff. So instead, I set font size to 62.5%, which effectively means that 1 rem is equal to 10 pixels, or 0.5 rem to 5 pixels, or 0.56 rem to 5.6 pixels. And yeah, it just goes on and on. But now we don't have to do these calculations, and we get the benefit of working with rem units. So that's kind of cool. Where was I? Advice generator. Yeah, we're just gonna add a little grid here now, because we want the grid and we want the top row. So these two are rows and this is a column. Yeah, this grid thing is a shorthand, as you can see, for a lot of stuff that you can put in here. So the top row will contain this box effectively, and this box will determine the entire height of this row effectively by itself, yeah, because it's going to take as much space as it wants and needs. The second row, 3.2 rem, is actually half of this 64 pixel button. So it's going to be perfectly kind of 32 here and 32 here, because we're going to actually make sure that it's spread there. Yeah, that would be good. Advice generator output. So now we're focusing on this container here. So let's just add a background so we can see it, little padding, you can see the changes rather quickly. We're going to have a display of flex, and we're going to make this into a flex column. Flex flow, if you're not familiar with this, is flex direction and flex wrap. So the direction we want is a column, and we don't want to wrap the content. And of course, let's add a little gap. And now you can see that the text, everything is not really aligned properly. So we could just start aligning stuff with, just align everything to the center with align items and justify content. And align items in the column case is of course the horizontal. And then this is just vertical if anything needs it. I don't actually think this is needed, but I'll take care of it later. Text align to the center. So before I save it, you can kind of see that text align is not aligned to the center right now in mobile. So we're gonna have to do it. Cool. And of course, grid row and grid column. I want it to be, if I show you the grid, it'll be easier to explain. So this is the first row and the first column. So 1, 2, 1, 2 between the two lines. 1, 2, and 1, 2. Cool. I think we can start doing the advice number. So this little span here. Font weight, as I said, I'm going to use 700. Font size, line height, letter spacing, and of course the color. And because we're on desktop size, it looks really tiny right now, so that's fine. We can add a little media query. I'm gonna choose again 545 pixels for this particular project, and then I'm just gonna add all this stuff. Perfect. Now we can start styling the quote. So cool. Font again 700, font weight, again line height, again letter spacing, and the color. And if you do have Figma, like this, a Figma file like this, and you're kind of wondering like, shit, how do I get these numbers? Whoops, wrong software. There, in this case, you just select something. Instead of, usually you're gonna be in design. Go to inspect on the top right, scroll down, and you're gonna see all this, basically the CSS that you can copy if you want. You can absolutely copy this stuff. I don't usually bother, to be honest, copying this. I just end up writing it. But yeah, you can absolutely copy this, convert it to rem, keep it as pixels, whatever you decide, right? It's up to you. But this is where you can find it, just in case you're unsure. Again, media query, because our quote will also be bigger for desktop, as we will see in a moment, just like that. Advice generator divider. So my divider is the picture element effectively, and I'm just gonna do display flex and width 100%. I don't know if I exactly have to do this, but I know when I work with flex and I add a width, everything just kind of works as expected for me. Whilst if sometimes I leave it out, it has a mind of its own. Yeah. In this case, I could have probably avoided it, but it's fine. No big deal. And picture, image inside of a picture. I want the margin to be auto, just so it positions itself perfectly to the center. And width 100 is actually so it's a bit more responsive. So right now you can see, instead of the picture taking its original size, whatever it was, just as an image, now we're actually kind of manipulating it. And I know the pose thing looks really tiny and stuff, but I'm always more concerned with responsiveness. How does it change based on the viewport? I don't care as much about an image being perfect. As long as it doesn't look terrible, it's okay. Advice generator button. So now we're actually going to work on the button. And I'm just trying to think if I missed something. Oh yeah, there's a little more gap here, if you can see. If I just select that, there's more gap here. There's 4 rem between the divider and the actual quote. Whilst on mobile there was only 2.4. So on mobile I was happy to use this gap, but then when the gap wasn't sufficient, I added a margin bottom on the quotation just so this divider is pushed downwards another 16 pixels just to make up that 4 rem or 40 pixels. Yeah. And our button again, for now width, dude, and now you can see it. Let's make it into a circle with border radius. And let's kind of position it. And here I think I made a mistake. It's fine because it's gonna work, but I think this should have been grid row 1. That's fine, we'll check in a moment. Place self and center. So when I'm placing to the end, let me show you the grid again. I'm placing basically the button vertically. I'm placing it here. This is, you know, to the end. And then the button is gonna push upwards essentially. And then center, of course, is horizontal. Yeah. And place self, another shorthand for align self and justify self. Really, really useful stuff if you work with CSS grid. Really useful. And of course, we want to transition this particular button because when we hover over it, we've got this effect. And again, if you're not sure, you can always just go into this, scroll down when you have inspect, and you can see the box shadow over here. You can just copy this. I think I changed it slightly though. And of course, cursor pointer when we hover over this button. Okay, so this is quite interesting if you're not familiar with it. So again, I'm selecting advice. Let me just close that. Advice generator button is hovered. So are we hovering over it or not? Now you could do without this is, you could remove all this stuff and just keep the hover bit, but I personally prefer writing it this way because now I can add stuff with a comma, or yeah, I can just add stuff with a comma, like hover, you know, focus within. And I think it's more readable in English. My brain works by reading literal language a lot of the time, or I think in images, and the more visual something is, the easier to understand, the better it is, I think. And of course, box shadow. So let's see how this looks like. So that's quite nice. And the only thing I thought we might just add just a tiny little fun thing. We're gonna select the generator image. We're going to add this transition of transform. And then when we hover, again, this is hover, over our generator button, let's select the image inside and transform rotated. Voila. And I think this concludes everything for CSS and HTML. It's time to move on to the JavaScript bit now. Just a quick warning, I took my time with the JavaScript bit. I wasn't sure what to miss out and what to include, so I tried not missing out anything. Okay, so since we're going to be doing JavaScript now, maybe let's kind of see the README file, right? Because in the README file, they give you this link, advice slip API. So if we visit this quickly, the very first thing, random advice, which is literally what we want. Advice is cached for 2 seconds. Any repeat request within 2 seconds will return the same piece of advice. So if we spam the button, basically, for a while, it's going to give you the same request. That's fine with me. And they give you the URL, basically, what returns you the object. And yes, it returns you an object, so that's cool. So you can just copy this link, and then I don't think you really need the API too much longer. Because now all we have now is the API link, and I'm just going to be trying to take you through a little journey of fetching data and async await. Well, now let's write a normal arrow function, right? Let's call it, what can I call it? Fetch new advice. Okay, I think I wrote this before, perfect. It's just a normal arrow function. And initially, let's just do, I don't know, const response equals fetch. And here we can just put API link. So we're trying to fetch some data, right? Okay. And let's call the function, of course. And let's just console log. Let's just see what's going on here. What is response? What is the result of this fetch? Okay, it's a promise. Promises, if you're not familiar with them, are quite, I think they're like relatively new in JavaScript. They've been around since 2017 or something. And what a promise is under the hood, without any magic or complex JavaScript ringing in your ears, yeah, it's an object, okay? It's an object, just a JavaScript object. So const object this, you can have, I don't know, data would be something, right? You will have status, So status, you might have think 200 or status 404 when a website can't find something, right? It's going to have a bunch of information essentially, but it's just an object. So that's the first thing to understand. A promise is an object, and most modern APIs will return you a promise. Now, in this case, it's actually a bit different because fetch returns you a promise. Fetch literally returns you a promise when it tries grabbing data. But you're always, at the very least, are going to receive an object. I don't think I've ever used an API where I received like a string or something. I'm sure it's possible. It's just not common, that's all. So, okay, so if a promise is an object and this promise has this pending thing, right? What do we do with that? And what the hell is pending? So a promise equals object, right? And a promise, it can also have states. States? Well, a state can basically be pending, it can be fulfilled, or I believe rejected is the word, but you know, basically failed, right? So right now, this when we console log this, we console log that as soon as JavaScript reads this line, it starts creating a promise because, you know, fetch returns you a promise and something's happening, but we console log too soon. That's why this promise is pending. So what we have to wait, what we have to do is to wait for this promise to be resolved. Now, how can we do this? This is where async await come in. So async might be a new concept as well. So I'm going to try explaining it really simply. Usually in JavaScript, let's just do, console log. Let's just console log 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see all of these happen in the sequence that your brain would probably agree with, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. If I put this here, you know, it's going to change the order logically because JavaScript reads things synchronously, right? It reads it line by line, and line 17 will block all the code below. All of this is blocked until line 17 finishes. So JavaScript makes you wait, right? It does everything line by line. And if it does things line by line, that can kind of like hold stuff up. So before, let's say if you were just trying to load some data, right? And you have this website, basically you're trying to load and do a bunch of JavaScript with it, nothing would happen because you're waiting for this information. And promises and asynchronous code and all this stuff is what, well, the developers thought, people who, you know, basically create all this stuff for us to use as developers, web developers, is these are tools for us to stop blocking this code, to have this very nice smooth experience. So synchronous code, line by line, blocks, right? But asynchronous code, now this changes the game, okay? So I'm gonna write something, set timeout, okay? Set timeout, it takes two things. It takes a function or a callback, and it takes like milliseconds. I'm gonna put 1 millisecond here. And what do we want to do? I just want to console log 2.5. So you can see, okay, console log 1, 2, 2.5, 3, 4. What the heck? 1, 2, 3, 4, 2.5. What happened? Well, it turns out that set timeout is asynchronous. It's not going to block your code. So it's just an example of asynchronous code, okay? It's not all of asynchronous code, just a bit. And all it means is that if you have this one lane where all your functions are basically racing, right? And every single function will block the other one. It's a single lane. There's no overtaking, okay? What set timeout did is it opened up another lane just for this function until it finished, and then it went back into its normal lane. Okay, that's kind of what asynchronous is. It's non-blocking. So hopefully that makes some sense. If it doesn't, just consume more information about it. Try playing around in CodePen, you know, like try figuring it out really, to spend some time with this concept. And don't worry if you don't understand it immediately, it's okay. All right. So as I said, we've got this response. It gives us this pending promise. We want to await it. Awesome. Let's await it. So what this function is doing now, this function will do everything just in its own time. It's not going to block any other function. So if I literally just console log one here again, you can see console log happened first, and then the response thing happened. Cool, right? Like that's relatively nice and simple. So we know that this function was asynchronous because we ran the function before the console log, but the results came in the reverse order. Console log came first, and our asynchronous non-blocking function came after. Perfect. So let's kind of study this object, right? So this is a fulfilled promise. Awesome. And you can see response. Don't confuse this with the variable name. I could call this potato. This would still be a response, okay? So just so you know. And there's a few useful things here. Response.ok, again, object, so .ok. Response.status. Yeah, these are really good. So status 200, everything was good. Yeah, response.ok basically tells you the same thing, I think. There might be a few little caveats that I'm not aware of, but feel free to research that. But where's our data, right? We're supposed to be getting a piece of advice. I'm expecting some text, a number. What the hell? Well, that's in body. And body you can think of as this kind of like a box, okay? Just like a promise, which is kind of a box that we have to wait to open. Body is also a box. And usually if you just click into it, it's not going to make too much sense, okay? Maybe you'll find the data you're looking for, maybe not. I wouldn't bother, because all you have to do is now we're going to create a new variable, const data, okay? And all we have to do is do response. So we have an object dot JSON, which is a method that we can run on this object. It's specific for async await, yeah. And let's just kind of see what this returns us, okay? So .json, if I show you this in mdn.json, like that, yes. So it's usually to do with a response, so that's good because we have a response, yeah. .json, and let's see what it returns. The return value is a promise again. So what do we do with promises? We wait for them to change from pending to fulfilled, so we can await it, and then we're gonna get something back. Let's see what we got back. Okay, this changed. Slip, and slip is basically an object within an object. So I'm not sure why, by the way, that makes no sense to me. Perfect. We have advice, we have ID. And if we refresh this page, we should get a different piece of advice and a different ID. Perfect. Okay. So relatively speaking, this is how you can fetch some data. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the remaining bits of JavaScript that will kind of like complete this exercise. So when you click this button, this stuff will refresh for new advice whilst fetching the data, right? Okay. The first thing we should do is return data here. And we can, I suppose instead of data, we can just call it advice, right? We're really returning some advice here, advice object, whatever you want to do. And an important thing about an asynchronous function to understand is that an asynchronous function returns a promise. So the same thing that we did here to await a promise, we're going to have to do somewhere else if we want to use this returned object, right? Because we were doing, fetching, we're waiting, we're opening the box with this .json, which actually it doesn't convert it to JSON. It kind of like unpackages the body for us to use as a normal object. Yeah, so it's rather from JSON to object, not the other way around. Then we want to return it. So this function effectively returns us a promise. Perfect. Okay. First few things we want is a few variables. Got some stuff open on the side, and I'm just gonna paste it in. Advice number span, so I'm just grabbing this here. Advice quote slot, so I'm just grabbing this. And fetch button, you might have guessed, it's this button. So I've just grabbed everything. Now we can do window dot add event listener, and when DOM content is loaded, so when everything has loaded in our HTML effectively, we want to do something. What do we want to do? Well, we've got a button that when we click this button, we want something to happen. So let's do that. Add event listener. When we click this button, we want something to happen. In this case, we want to generate new advice. And because I'm pushing this as a callback, you can rightfully assume, let's just delete these things, that I'm going to need to create a new arrow function, just as so. And I'm going to be using our fetch new advice function, but because this returns as a promise, and let me show you exactly what I mean. Const data equals fetch new advice, just like that. And then let's just do console.log data. Okay, let's see what happens, right? Click, promise pending, just like before. So just like before, if we have a pending promise that, is going to return us some data, we just want to wait for it, await it, effectively. Let's click it, perfect, slip. Okay, so we've got our data, right? And what can I have now? I suppose just so I don't have to do the slip bit later on, at const advice is response.slip. So we're just going to be returned with this stuff, this object. And then what we want to do is render stuff. Yeah, so we want to render it to the browser. So we want to show this information here. So how do we do that? Let's just create render advice as a function. Let's pass in this object, and just so we're all sure that it's an object, console log advice. Let me just comment this out. Let me click the button. Response is not defined. Yes, I changed it to data. It's okay. Perfect. We've got the ID, we've got the advice. It's an object. Everything is as expected. Render. So we're gonna have to create a new function now called render advice. It's going to receive an advice object. Okay. And here we can destructure the object. So we know there's ID and advice, just as you can see on the right. So let's do that. Const ID advice, just so we can easily refer back to it, and advice object, just like that. So now we're gonna be able to work with these two things from an object. Perfect. And all we really have to do is advice number span dot text content is, and I'm going to use backticks because I want to use some normal text. Let's just copy the whole thing. I want to use some normal text without this, but instead of this number, we want to use the new number. So let's use ID over here. So you put a $sign, the curly brackets, and then you put a variable, and it sticks the variable into the string together. Very nice. And finally, advice quote slot text content equals, and I'm pretty sure, yes, they do add quotation marks, so we can just do advice. And let's see. Very nice. Everything is being updated. If I spam it, if you remember, 2 seconds cache is happening. But that's it. That's everything you really need to understand on how to work with like a basic API. And then how do you return some data? How do you grab some data later on from this function? How do you nicely, cleanly put the stuff into separate functions, really, right? Because that was the piece of advice I was missing in the beginning. How do you do it in these nice succinct steps? This is it. If you're interested in learning the older ways of doing stuff, you would see fetch, API link, and here you would see .then, data.json and another .then. I can cover this stuff as well if someone wants me to. Just comment down below. But I think it's a inferior method of fetching data. I think this is much better to do, because async await, it just looks like normal code. You know, it doesn't look very different from JavaScript. You can save everything very neatly in these variables step by step. Personally, I think it's better. So yeah, it's really up to you. Let me know. Without further ado, some brief testing, I think we are done. It's responsive. I don't think I'm gonna have to worry about that. Yeah, cool. Hope you enjoyed. Ciao.